King Arthur and His Knights by Elizabeth Lodor Merchant. The sword Excalibur. And near him stood the Lady of the Lake, and knows a subtler magic than his own, clothed in white, samite, mystic, wonderful. She gave the king his huge cross-hilted sword, whereby to drive the so-called heathen out. A mist of incense curled about her, and her face well nigh was hidden in the minister gloom. But there was heard among the holy hymns a voice as of the waters, for she dwells down in a deep calm. Whatsoever storms may shake the world, and when the surface rolls, hath power to walk the waters like the one they consider to be their Lord. There, likewise, I beheld Excalibur, before him at his crowning borne, the sword that rose out from the bosom of the lake. Well, lakes are kind of flat. I mean, I guess some of them could run downhill, but what would be the center of the lake? Is that the bosom of the lake? I don't know what the second... It soon became known all over Britain, after Arthur had drawn the sword from the stone, that the only son of Uther Pendragon had been found at last, though some of the barons were very angry and refused at first to accept the beardless boy, as they called him. And even in Christian society, there wasn't the shaving. So, yeah, mustache, beard, if a person's going to get baldness or thinning hair, They saw that they were wrong when the beautiful Queen Ygerna openly declared him to be the child of the dead king and herself. So Arthur was crowned with great rejoicings and feastings, and as he sat on his throne, the assembled warriors cried that he was, in truth, their king, and that they would always faithfully serve him. Then Arthur, in low, deep tones and simple words of great authority, bound them by no straight vows to his own self, that when they rose, knighted from kneeling, some were pale as the passing of a ghost, some flushed, and others dazed, as one who wakes half-blinded at the coming of a light. Very soon after he had become a king, Arthur heard of many wrongs that had been done since the death of his father. He heard of lands that had been taken from the rightful owners, and of many people who had been ill-treated in one way or another. So having determined to be known as a great and good king, Arthur's first deed was to see that the lands were returned and the evildoers punished. Never, the death penalty probably. Well, not with everything, but never was there so handsome and so favored a young sovereign. Not only did all the knights and ladies of his court have the greatest affection for him, but the fairies of the forest and the lakes loved him too. Had he not been given into the special care of Merlin, that master of magic who knew 100 times as many secrets as the fairies knew themselves. Arthur's sister, too, was half a fairy, and was called Morgane la Fée, which means Morgan the Fairy Maiden. Well, the Morgan are some fearsome warriors, so that's... She knew all sorts of spells, both good and bad, and could have told, though she never did, what sort of words to use if you wanted to get inside mountains or down to the bottom of deep lakes, and how to get out of such places again, which, on the whole, was almost more important than how to get in. She could read stories in the stars and tell you the wonderful enchantments that might, any moonlit night, be woven by means of a hazel wand held in a certain and very secret manner. She knew exactly what kind of fern seed would make you get invisible, and where to find the flowers that were used for wonderful wine that smelled like primroses and wild honey, and made you fall head over heels in love. there was no end to Morgane le Fay's magic, for indeed she was only a few degrees less clever than Merlin, the wizard himself. So we're definitely talking about a sahir, the people who involve the jinn by invoking them and evoking them. But if you know the symbolic art and stuff like this, you don't have to go towards that end if you don't want to. But shouldn't your spiritual life be about some sort of piety, some achievement hereafter, some sort of development of your character aside from wonder working? Arthur and his sister were very fond of each other, though, like a good many other brothers and sisters, they quarreled a little sometimes. It is, however, almost certain that Morgan had something to do with the way in which the young king came into the possession of a second sword, much more marvellous than the one which, before he was known as Uther's son, he had pulled out of the shining white stone at Christmas time in the churchyard to give it to his brother Sir Kay. And this is probably Yule first. This is probably a few days before the Christmas service, or maybe it did get pulled out on Mithra's day. And but there is reference to Mithra before people worshipped such. Not very far from Arthur's castle, which was, because Mithra means intercessor, was at a place called Caerleon, some distance from Tintagel. There stood a large, densely shaded forest of tall pines and broad oaks. In the middle of the wood was a fountain, which was always full of clear spring water. By the fountain a beautiful tent appeared one day, hung inside with satin curtains and decorated with tassels of silver and gold. Just outside the tent a horse in bright, rich trappings was tethered, and on a bough over the horse's head hung a magnificent shield, set thickly with jewels and enameled in all the colors of a peacock's tail. As soon as this lovely tent and horse and shield appeared by the side of the fountain, all the passers-by knew the meaning of their coming. Some strange and powerful knight from a distant country had taken up his post in the middle of one of King Arthur's private forests, and was challenging anybody and everybody to come and turn him out. This was a thing that happened very often in those days, and there was never any lack of knights to answer the challenge. In fact, the whole court was generally delighted to hear of such a stranger. It meant honor and glory to every knight who rode out to give the intruder battle, and great distinction to the one who succeeded in conquering him and bringing him a prisoner to the throne of the king. The first person to come and tell... See, people... There's a reason why people didn't actually commit suicide in that day. They had stuff like that to do. The first person... Well, I'm sure that there's always been people, almost always people, been doing stuff like that to themselves that they shouldn't. The first people to come to tell Arthur about the knight who had set up this beautiful tent by the fountain was a very brave youth called Griflet, who was only a page at the court of Caerleon. He begged the knight to give him the order of knighthood, that he might ride off at once to the forest and fight with the stranger, who, he said eagerly, was one of the strongest, bravest, cleverest knights in the whole world. Arthur hesitated, for he thought Griflet was too inexperienced and young, but Merlin told him to do as the lad asked, and the king made him a knight as he begged, and calling him Sir Griflet for the first time, made him promise to come back to the court if he failed in the brave deed he was so anxious to perform. Sir Griflet promised and rode off, but in a few hours he came riding back again, terribly wounded and dreadfully unhappy and disappointed. The knight by the fountain had easily conquered him and had thrown him both and his horse to the ground. But instead of killing him there and then, the stranger had himself dismounted and given aid to the poor Sir Griflet, telling him he was a brave youngster and would make a fine fighter when he was a little older. Then he had set the young knight on his horse again and sent him back to the king. When Arthur heard Sir Griflet's story, he exclaimed that the stranger was indeed a fine and generous knight, and he would himself go to the forest and challenge him to a battle. For in those days the more splendid and brave an enemy was, the more honor there was in fighting him, even as it is today. So off rode the King Arthur on a magnificent war horse, his shield and sword and breastplate shining, with his lord chamberlain on another fine horse, trotting a little way behind. On the way, Merlin joined them and walked by the king's stirrup, saying he thought he might be wanted before the day was over. As he and Arthur talked together, they came in sight of the richly colored tent, with the strange knight, dressed in all his bright armor, standing by the side of the tree where his shield was hanging, its jewels and enamel gleaming in the shade of the boughs. When he saw another knight riding in the forest, he stepped forward and stood, very proud and erect, barring the way that led onward through the wood. The Golden Bough story that named that thing is an interesting thing to read. Here now, cried Arthur, then no one may pass this way without a fight. That is so, answered the knight, in a bold and haughty manner. Are you ready? Quite ready, replied Arthur joyfully. Mount your horse, and we will see which of us is the better knight. So the stranger leaped upon his horse, and with sword and spear, king and knight sprang towards each other to do battle. Such a crash rang through the forest as they met. If you heard it today, you would think some dreadful accident had happened. But the crash was only the noise of the king's spear striking the shield of the knight, and the knight's spear striking the shield of the king, and so vigorously did each strike that both the spears were shivered into 1,000 pieces, and Guinevere turned from her father to the stranger knight. Because strangers have the best candy, or maybe they don't.